For decades, every successive government in the US has invested heavily in expanding its military influence. This is why not only does the US have the strongest military in the world, but it also has the highest number of military bases in the world. Some of these bases are located in the African continent. However, in an interesting turn of events, the administration of President Trump is currently contemplating dismantling the U.S. Africa Command, a military organization regulating the U.S. base in Africa. The question is, why is President Trump making this move? And what are the implications for the African continent? Let's find out. President Trump is not just shaking the world with his decisions, he is also shaking America. Last month, Trump fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Force General C.Q. Brown, and pushed out 5 other admirals and generals in an unprecedented shakeup of U.S. military leadership. This decision set off a period of upheaval at the Pentagon, which was already bracing for mass firings of civilian staff, a dramatic overhaul of its budget, and a shift in military deployments under Trump's New America First foreign policy. Following this decision, Trump's administration is currently considering a proposal to eliminate the U.S. Africa Command as part of a broader Pentagon downsizing effort. According to the reports, several U.S. defense officials are already in favor of the change. The proposed move intends to transfer AFRICOM to a subcommand position under the European Command. Those who support the move contend that moving AFRICOM under EUCOM would help simplify command structures and cut down on bureaucracy. They also believe it could make it easier for the administration to withdraw U.S. troops from certain areas in Africa, like Somalia. However, opponents have since reportedly argued that this would diminish U.S. military influence in Africa, creating a space that could be filled by Russia and China. They are also concerned that downsizing could reduce the overall influence of U.S. operations in the region. Before we proceed, here is a reminder to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel so that you can get more videos like this. What all this simply means is that the U.S. is contemplating reducing its military influence in Africa. This would mean removing its numerous military bases. However, while there is no permanent decision yet, the fact that Trump is even considering it is quite interesting. You see, the U.S. currently has the highest number of military bases and troops in Africa. It has 7,000 military personnel on rotational deployment in Africa. These troops supposedly carry out joint operations with African forces against extremists or jihadists. In addition to this, 2,000 American soldiers are involved in training missions in 40 African countries. American special forces operate across East Africa in so-called forward operation locations in Kenya and Somalia. Interestingly, the media used to publish that the USA only has one permanent camp in Africa located in Djibouti, known as Camp Lemonnier, but a 2019 document that was recently leaked revealed that the US has a total of 29 bases located in 15 different countries in Africa. Imagine that. Now, overseeing all these bases is the United States Africa Command, known as AFRICOM. Prior to the establishment of the US AFRICOM in 2007, the US already had a military presence on the African continent. It included the Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa, which has 700 troops at Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Initiative, and the U.S. Naval Forces with a presence in the Gulf of Guinea, where oil supplies are becoming increasingly important to the U.S. All of these U.S. military were under a partnership with the European military. The African continent was divided into 3 different military commands, just like during the scramble for Africa. The U.S. European Command, EUCOM, was responsible for the largest swath of the continent, namely North Africa, West Africa, and Central and Southern Africa. The U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, covered the Horn of Africa, including Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Kenya, Djibouti, Sudan, Egypt, and the Seychelles, while the U.S. Pacific Command was responsible for Madagascar and the Indian Ocean area off the African coast. During this period, the military presence of the United States in Africa could be regarded as light. In fact, Africa was not a top priority for the U.S. government and its military at this time. However, it became necessary for the U.S. to create a separate military organization that would answer directly to the U.S. government when it became obvious that Africa's geostrategic significance was on the rise and the U.S. influence was on the decline. According to research, Africa is predicted to account for about 25% of the world's population by 2050. The continent currently contains some of the world's fastest-growing economies, and by 2063, the continent as a whole is expected to become the world's third-largest economy, surpassing Germany, France, India, and the United Kingdom. Also, according to the United Nations, approximately 30% of the world's mineral reserves can be found in Africa, along with 12% of the world's oil and 8% of the world's natural gas reserves. Africa is also home to 65% of the world's arable land and 10% of the planet's renewable freshwater sources. So you can see why in the past decade, the number of foreign countries competing for influence in Africa, including China, Russia, and European countries, has increased. Certainly, the United States would not want to miss out on it. So former President Bush began to push U.S. policymakers for a more focused approach toward Africa. In his own words, in Africa, promise and opportunity sit side by side with disease, war, and desperate poverty. This threatens both a core value of the United States, preserving human dignity, and our strategic priority, combating global terror. Can you imagine the condescending statement? But why is it then that despite the negative reactions and resentment by African leaders towards the establishment of AFRICOM, the organization was still established and has increasingly grown in power as strength? Well, AFRICOM always say that they set up their bases in collaboration and partnership with African countries. But this term partnership is not truly what we know it to be. African partnership with the West has always been paternalistic, imperialist, and geared towards the benefit of the West. It's the same way with AFRICOM. Imagine this scenario: the US comes to an African country and says it wants to set up a military base in its country, but the African country says no. Then the US comes again, but this time it's with a threat, an economic diplomatic threat. If the African country refuses to heed to the US, then they won't have access to the loan they may have been asking the IMF or World Bank to grant them. This is what is happening in the background, but nobody would say it. Indeed, the US uses its influence as the International Monetary Fund's, IMF, largest financial contributor, as leverage in its negotiations with African states to ensure their cooperation on matters of security. As scholar Zohra Ahmed has explained, the kinds of international relationships the United States cultivates in support of its wars fall somewhere in a legal gray zone between consent and coercion. And due to the economic constraint and continued dependence on foreign loans to sustain the African economy, the African government would have no choice but to comply with the priorities of the US government. It is devastating that the same country that speaks about human dignity, justice, sovereignty, and human rights is the same one that is trampling on the dignity and sovereignty of other nations just because it has more power. However, this is even the least of what AFRICOM is doing in Africa. If you search AFRICOM's website for news about Camp Lemonnier, which the US formerly said was the only military base in Africa, but we now know it's a lie, you will find several feel-good stories about green energy initiatives, the drilling of water wells, and so many other things. But that's far from the truth. The truth is that the base is a linchpin for US military action in Africa. According to General Carter, commander of AFRICOM 2012, Camp Lemonnier is an essential regional power projection base that enables the operations of multiple combatant commands. A map in the Pentagon report indicates that there were 10 MQ-1 Predator drones and 4 larger, more far-ranging MQ-9 Reapers based at Camp Lemonnier in June 2012. There were also 6 U-28A, a single-engine aircraft that conducts surveillance for Special Operations Forces, and 2 P-3 Orions, a 4-engine turboprop aircraft originally developed for maritime patrols, but since repurposed for use over African countries. The map also shows the presence of 8 F-15E Strike Eagles, manned fighter jets that are much faster and more heavily armed than drones. By August 2012, an average of 16 drones and 4 fighter jets were taking off or landing there each day. As it grew, Camp Lemonnier became one of the most critical bases not only for America's drone assassination campaign in Somalia and Yemen, but also for US military operations across the region. The camp is so crucial to long-term military plans that the U.S. inked a deal securing its lease until 2044, agreeing to hand over $70 million per year in rent, about double what it previously paid to the government of Djibouti. Now, one thing that the U.S. is wary of in terms of its supposed military partnership with Africa is costs, specifically the cost associated with deploying its own troops to the front lines. For this reason, AFRICOM carries out what is called a 127E program. This program, named for a budgetary authority, allows U.S. Special Operations Forces to use local military units as surrogates in counterterrorism missions. This simply means using African solutions for American problems. AFRICOM relies on African forces to assume the burden of counterterrorism missions on the continent. In addition, using the African military has led to internal divisions within national militaries across the continent. In Somalia, for instance, the sheer number of U.S.-led training of different, in many cases newly formed, security bodies within the country has spurred competition for power among security actors. The formation and training of these elite units also causes a division between the special forces and the common soldier, a phenomenon political scientist Rahman Idrissa described as a military caste system. Now, even though AFRICOM says it's in partnership with African countries to not even fight war, but to prevent it from happening, the operations of the U.S. military are shrouded in secrecy. In most of the missions carried out by the U.S. operatives, African governments are usually not aware of what they do and why they do it. And yet, it's called a partnership. Even basic information like the sweep and scope of deployments by elite U.S. troops and clandestine combat by American commandos on the continent is mostly unreported across Africa. If you watch our video on U.S. secret biolabs in Africa, you will see how, with the aid of the U.S. military, the U.S. has set up hundreds of labs across the African continent, which they sometimes use to experiment on the local populace. Why would they keep their operations secret from their African partners if they are not doing something suspicious in the country? So you see that AFRICOM is beyond promoting the interest of the U.S., which President Bush said is fighting terrorism before it happens. In fact, if that were true, why are terrorism and insecurity currently widespread in the continent? The United States military came into the continent based on the idea that Africa is not capable of solving its problem. The governments are too weak and the people too dull, right? Now, AFRICOM, whose goal is to prevent war and insecurity, which have been in the continent since 2007 and conducting secret missions all over the continent. Yet with all their high-tech grade military equipment, they were not able to prevent terrorism and Islamist jihadists from breaking out in Mali and spreading all across the Sahel region. They can't tell us that they were not aware of the plans of the jihadists with all their high-tech equipment used for spy missions across the African continent. And let's say they were not aware. Why couldn't they have eliminated the threat of these terrorists when they just started? It's just obvious that fighting terrorism was just an excuse given to the public as to why the U.S. needed to create AFRICOM. As we said, AFRICOM is solely in Africa to promote American interests, which doesn't have anything to do with terrorism. Specifically, AFRICOM is present in Africa for resource exploitation. Africa is the world's second largest continent in terms of landmass and population, with a large range of important natural resources. The container alone holds 30% of all mineral reserves, 12% of known oil reserves, 8% of known natural gas, and 65% of the world's arable land. However, the power of Western multinational corporations and the lack of sufficient industrialization in most African countries has left the continent in a state of dependency on foreign countries. This condition of dependency was structured by the policies of the colonial rulers, who maintained economic activity in Africa based on the extraction and growth of raw materials and then passed on to generations of post-colonial elites, who did nothing to change the structure. This state of continued economic dependency has created avenues for manipulation by these foreign governments who have a permanent interest in Africa. That's why, for instance, in return for land where a military base will be constructed, foreign countries, such as the US or the UK, would offer aid to a particular African country where they desire to set up a base. In addition, the economic situation of countries in Africa has led to conflict issues, which have also given countries like the US and France to set up military bases with the excuse that they are trying to settle conflicts. In reality, however, facts have shown that these countries set up their military bases close to where there are mineral resources in Africa. Take, for instance, the U.S. military lily pad base in Sao Tome and Principe in the Gulf of Guinea. When asked, the U.S. would say that the reason for this military base in the Gulf of Guinea is to reduce the growth of Islamic militancy. But then the governments of these African countries agree that these groups do not have a threatening presence there. So why then does the U.S. have a military base there? It's simply to protect the movement of Nigerian and Gulf of Guinea oil to the U.S. Another instance that justifies that foreign military bases are for the exploitation of African resources is what happened in 2007. During this year, about 1.7 billion barrels of oil were discovered at the border of Congo and Uganda in the Lake Albert region. And guess what happened next? This region became immediately militarized by the U.S. Army. In addition to this, the presence of AFRICOM in Africa is to reduce China and Russia's influence. This is the reason given by those who oppose the plan to dismantle the U.S. AFRICOM. The U.S. wants to remain the dominant force in Africa, and one way it has maintained that dominance is through its military. Now, whether or not Trump decides to dismantle the U.S. AFRICOM, the most important question is, why are there so many foreign bases in Africa? The simple answer is that African countries have a weak government and weak institutions such as the African Union. The president of Djibouti is a perfect example of an African leader who has allowed different foreign countries, including the US, France, and China, to set up military bases in the country for some benefits. These benefits include the lease on the land, which is worth billions of dollars, where the base will be set up, and also protection against opposition forces. Ghana is also another example. In 2018, the U.S. Department of Defense proposed that the U.S. and Ghana agree to a Status of Forces Agreement, SOFA, a $20 million deal that would allow the U.S. military to expand its presence in Ghana. This proposal, however, was met with disapproval by the population and the opposition party, which believed that this agreement would mean that there was a possibility that the U.S. would build a military base in the country. And so, by April of the same year, the president of Ghana claimed that his government had not offered a military base and will not offer a military base to the United States of America. However, in May 2018, the SOFA agreement was signed, and from what can be observed from the binding document, the U.S. is permitted to create its own military facilities in Ghana. By any definition, this means that it can set up a base. In recent times, there have been growing concerns about the increasing number of bases in the African continent, but sadly, that's where it ends. No action has been taken to stop these foreign countries from hosting their military base, something they would never allow African countries to do. It's obvious that these countries see the African continent as a weak child, who would accept anything that us ditched out to them. The African Union is not even helping matters. The fact that they depend on 98% of their funding from external partners such as the European Union limits their ability to stop the setting up of military bases by foreign countries. No true independent nation will willingly allow another country to set up a military base on its soil. From the time Western countries started setting up their bases on African soil, there have been calls by some African leaders to remove those bases because those foreign bases are a deviation from the anti-imperialist ideals of the struggles that brought independence to Africa. In 1964, Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser called for the removal of these bases, and in 1970, after Colonel Muammar Gaddafi overthrew the monarchy, the bases were removed. In most recent times, some African leaders have also called for the removal of these bases. But they have not just called for the removal of these bases, they have actually dismantled these bases. We are talking about the leaders of the Sahel region. The military leaders of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have kicked out France and US bases. They are a testament to the fact that African leaders can be strong if they decide to. If Trump eventually decides to dismantle the US AFRICOM, he would be doing Africa a huge favor. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and share.